Picture this, you're standing in the shadow of Palatine Hill, the heart of the Roman Empire. The year is 218 CE, but something about Rome feels off. The air hangs heavy with the sweetness of imported incense, and Eastern perfumes so thick it suffocates as if trying to mask the underlying scent of blood and rot. From deep within the palace walls, drums and flutes echo outward, not the refined music of imperial ceremonies, but something primal, hypnotic, a rhythm that stirs the blood and clouds the mind. A slave rushes past you, his face pale as chalk clutching a golden chalice, so tightly the veins in his hands bulge. His eyes dart from side to side, like he's being hunted not by soldiers, but by something unseen or divine. Even the Praetorian Guard, the elite protectors of Rome, march in near silence, their bronze helmets gleaming in the Mediterranean sun. One murmurs to another, barely above a whisper, "This is blasphemy." The gods will not stay silent. But he says it so softly you wonder if he's afraid the palace itself might hear. Inside, a voice rises above the chaos, clear young, but laced with unnatural authority. It does not belong to the emperor you've known, but to a 14-year-old boy from Syria who now rules the empire, not with a sword, but with something far more dangerous, divine belief. They call him Elagabalus, but that's not his birth name. It's the name of the god he claims to embody. In the eyes of many Romans, he is not a ruler, but a blasphemy made flesh, a sacred violation wearing silk and gold. No one understands how this happened. Rome, city of law, order, and unshakable masculine virtue, now bows to a boy painted like a bride, dressed in translucent robes, who calls a meteorite his husband. A silent question simmers beneath the marble pillars, behind the anxious eyes of senators, guards, and citizens alike. How did the most powerful empire in human history fall into the hands of a child like this? And more urgently, what is this the beginning of? To understand how a painted boy from Syria seized the throne of the greatest empire the world had ever seen, you must travel east far from Rome's marble columns and rigid traditions to the incense-choked city of Emesa, where gods did not reside in statues, but moved through flesh, blood, and ecstasy. It is here, beneath the burning sun of the Syrian plains, that Varius Avitus Bassianus was born around 204 CE. But even his name would later be erased, rewritten, and reshaped, because to rule Rome, identity was never fixed. It was forged. From the moment of his birth, Varius was surrounded by divine theater. Emesa was no ordinary city. It was the heart of the cult of Elagabal, the sun god, whose symbol was no sculpture or painting, but a massive black meteorite said to have fallen from the heavens. This stone, dark, smooth, unknowable, was housed in a grand temple tended by priests who chanted in tongues lost to history. The city pulsed with rituals that blurred the lines between sacred and profane gender and godhood. Worship was not distant reverence. It was surrender. Bodies danced, moaned, bled, and merged with the divine until worshippers didn't know where they ended and the gods began. This was the air Varius breathed as a child, and his bloodline nothing short of dangerous. His mother, Julia Soaemias, was a woman whose ambition burned hotter than the Syrian sun. She wasn't content with temple offerings or backroom influence. She wanted the throne. Her aunt, Julia Domna, had been the Empress of Rome as the wife of Septimius Severus. Her cousin Caracalla had ruled as emperor before being assassinated in 217 CE. The dynasty had crumbled, but the hunger for power remained. Soaemias watched, waited, and plotted. She saw in her son not just a boy, but a symbol, a weapon. He was beautiful, androgynous, magnetic, and crucially, he was a high priest of Elagabal, already revered by his followers, not just as a servant of God, but as God incarnate. Rome, meanwhile, was in chaos. The emperor, at the time Macrinus, had seized the throne through assassination and ruled with the cold calculation of a bureaucrat, not the bloodline of a Caesar. And worse, he made the fatal mistake of cutting military pay. The Syrian legions were furious. They didn't care for his frugality or reforms. They wanted gold glory and a leader they could worship. Julia Soaemias made her move. She began spreading a lie so scandalous it gained power through its audacity that Varius was the secret son of Caracalla, born from an incestuous union with his sister. In a world where legitimacy came from bloodlines, and bloodlines could be fabricated, this lie wasn't weakness, it was strategy. It gave the troops something to believe in, it gave the Senate something to fear. Now, picture the moment, May 218 CE, in the Syrian military camp of Legio III Gallica. The soldiers are restless. Whispers of revolt hang in the air like heat. Then Soaemias arrives dressed not as a grieving widow, but as a queen of prophecy, with her son at her side. The boy wears imperial purple robes, his face painted with cosmetics in the Eastern tradition. He glides more than walks, every gesture measured fluid, unsettling. This is no Roman prince. This is something stranger, something holy. She tells the legion what they long to hear. This is Caracalla's heir. This is the son of the god Elagabal. This is the child who will restore their wages, their pride, their glory. The boy says nothing but lifts his hands in a gesture of blessing, as if channeling divine approval. And one by one the soldiers kneel. The proclamation echoes through the desert air. Hail Caesar, hail Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, hail Elagabalus. Yes, Marcus Aurelius Antoninus. The name is a lie, a calculated theft from one of Rome's most revered emperors, but in the game of empire, truth is negotiable. What matters is belief, and in that moment, thousands believed. Across the empire, Macrinus felt the ground shift beneath his feet. This was no ordinary rebellion. This wasn't a rival general or an ambitious senator. This was a child backed by a mother's fury, a legion's rage, and a god's name. Worse reports filtered in that the boy was not only claiming to be emperor, but God incarnate. He performed rites with dancers, chanted in foreign tongues, blessed soldiers with oils and blood. His rise blurred the line between politics and prophecy, between military strategy and religious mania. And how do you fight that? Macrinus marched south to crush the rebellion. But by the time he reached the boys' camp, it was too late. His soldiers too began to waver. They heard the music, they saw the splendor, and more than anything, they felt the pull of something ancient, something irrational, but irresistible. A boy wrapped in gold silk, worshipped as both Caesar and sun god, stood at the heart of the camp, and the empire trembled. Macrinus fled. He was captured and executed, his head sent to the boy as tribute. And thus Varius Avitus Bassianus, born in the incense and blood of Syrian ritual, became Elagabalus, emperor of Rome. But as the black meteorite was readied for transport to the capital, and as the boy prepared to enter the eternal city, not as a servant of the gods, but as one, the question whispered through every corridor of power remained. What happens when a god sits on a human throne? The journey from Syria to Rome was not a military campaign. It was a procession of myth, a movement of meaning, and at its center was not a warrior or a ruler, but a boy clad in silk carrying a god in his wake. As Elagabalus moved westward, the empire watched in disbelief. For centuries, Rome had conquered the East, absorbing its territories, its treasures, even its gods, but never had the East come for Rome itself. Not like this, not as a conqueror, but as a transformation. And certainly not embodied in a teenage priest who spoke with the voice of a deity and wore the perfume of seduction more often than the armor of a general. Picture the caravan, a golden chariot pulled by white horses surrounded by dancers, musicians, Syrian priests in shimmering robes, and guards who still weren't sure what they were guarding. Among them were sacred prostitutes, painted courtiers, and lavish displays of Eastern wealth that made Roman eyes widen, with a mix of awe and horror. At the very center of it all, raised on a gilded platform, stood the black meteorite of Elagabal, the living stone that represented the sun god now being brought to Rome as a holy artifact, or perhaps a warning. But it wasn't the stone alone that unsettled the people. It was the boy. Each town along the route whispered a different version of his appearance. In some cities he arrived draped in imperial purple calm and composed delivering blessings like a Roman emperor. In others he emerged in flowing Syrian gowns, face-painted eyes lined with kohl, dancing barefoot through crowds, with a smile that was neither innocent nor sane. He shifted identities like veils, sometimes man, sometimes woman, sometimes something. No Roman had words for. By the time the caravan reached the outskirts of Rome in the summer of 219, CI rumors had outrun it. The Senate convened in anxious silence, debating behind closed doors whether they should welcome this boy or barricade the city. But it was too late. The gates opened, and Rome, eternal proud imperial Rome, held its breath. Elagabalus entered not as a general, but as a revelation. Standing beside his sacred stone, he offered blessings to the crowd. Some cheered, intoxicated by spectacle. Others turned away, eyes averted, as if shielding themselves from blasphemy. For many it felt less like the arrival of an emperor, and more like the beginning of a ritual that no one had agreed to participate in. Within days of his arrival, the true transformation began. His first decree shocked the priesthood. He would marry the goddess Minerva, Rome's symbol of wisdom and war, to the black stone of Elagabal in a sacred union of East and West. No one had ever dared to wed gods across cultures, let alone in such theatrical fashion. The ceremony was held publicly. The stone was dressed in fine robes, Minerva's statue adorned with veils, and Elagabalus himself presided as high priest and sovereign, chanting in a language few understood, but none could ignore. Rome had seen decadence before. It had endured mad emperors, brutal tyrants, and lavish orgies. But this was something different. This was systemic ecstasy. The lines between ruler and priest, between man and woman, between human and divine, were not just blurred, they were annihilated. Temples once dedicated to Jupiter and Mars were stripped of their power. New shrines rose in honor of Elagabal. Syrian priests were installed in high religious offices, pushing out the old Roman orders. Public festivals became surreal spectacles, half pagan celebration, half spiritual possession. Women were encouraged to adopt male dress for rituals. Men painted their faces and danced through the forum. The very soul of Rome, its rituals, laws, and hierarchy, was being rewritten by a teenager who claimed to channel the will of the sun. And the people they adapted, or at least pretended to. Shopkeepers hung new idols. Courtiers whispered prayers they didn't understand. Senators sent gifts to the emperor's Syrian companions, hoping to buy protection or mercy. But underneath the painted smiles and sudden silences, something simmered. Rome had always been conservative beneath its marble facade, and now the very foundation of that conservatism was cracking. Among the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's own protectors' loyalty turned to confusion. Their emperor danced in silk. He kissed men in public. He whispered to gods whose names were never spoken in Latin. He promised a golden age, but brought a foreign sun that burned away everything Roman. And still, the boy smiled. He believed he was changing the world. He wasn't wrong, because in the heart of Rome, the question now took root, not whispered in shadows, but growing louder each day. What does it mean to be emperor? What does it mean to be Roman? And more dangerously, what if the old answers no longer applied? Elagabalus wasn't simply ruling Rome, he was remaking it. Rome had weathered madmen before. It had endured the paranoia of Tiberius, the bloodlust of Caligula, the decadence of Nero. But this was different. Elagabalus wasn't simply mad. He wasn't cruel in the conventional sense. What unsettled Rome wasn't his rage, but his joy. His unrelenting, ecstatic defiance of every sacred boundary the empire had spent centuries erecting. He didn't rule with fear, he ruled with transformation. And for a city built on order, hierarchy, and masculine virtue, that was far more dangerous. Within weeks of Elagabalus's arrival, Rome found itself unmoored. The black meteorite Elagabal was installed atop the Palatine Hill, its sacred temple rising with unnatural speed. Workers labored day and night as the emperor demanded a shrine worthy not of a Roman god, but of the celestial fire he claimed to embody. Statues of Jupiter and Mars were pushed to the margins. Altars that had burned for generations went cold. In their place came incense from Syria, drums that echoed at midnight, and rituals performed in languages that made seasoned senators shudder. The boy emperor's behavior became more erratic, more theatrical, and more intentional. One day he would appear in full imperial regalia, draped in purple, flanked by soldiers. The next he'd glide through the streets in translucent silk eyes, rimmed with black coal lips, red with rouge, his hair adorned with golden pins. He hosted ceremonies in which he declared himself both bride and groom, both man and goddess, both Caesar and priestess. In one festival he claimed to wed the moon, in another he announced he was pregnant with divine light. To the common Roman, it was no longer possible to pretend this was politics as usual. Fathers struggled to explain to their sons why the emperor wore pearl necklaces and kissed male courtiers in public. Mothers whispered warnings to daughters not to speak too loudly of the temple rituals, lest the wrong ears hear. Rome wasn't just being governed, it was being seduced, rewritten, intoxicated. The aristocracy was horrified. For centuries, Roman masculinity had been the cornerstone of civilization, stoic, rational, dominant. Elagabalus was none of these things. He spoke of submission as strength. He celebrated beauty over discipline, sensation over law. He elevated lovers and dancers to positions of power, selecting advisors not for wisdom, but for charm. The Senate chamber, once the domain of stern voices and grim decisions, now rang with foreign music and the scent of myrrh. And yet Elagabalus's power held, because beneath the absurdity there was something terrifyingly effective in his methods. He didn't try to destroy the Roman system by force. He dissolved it, laughed at it, replaced its ceremonies with pageantry, so dazzling, so erotic, so alien that the old rites seemed dull and lifeless by comparison. What is loyalty when your emperor performs miracles? What is tradition when your god lives in the palace? But behind the spectacle, cracks were forming. The Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers tasked with protecting the emperor, grew increasingly uneasy. They were Romans trained in discipline, raised on tales of glory and duty. Their understanding of emperor did not include a boy who worshipped a stone and called eunuchs his husbands. Day by day, their silence grew heavier. Their eyes lingered longer on the emperor's back. Inside the palace, the mood darkened. Elagabalus, once radiant and untouchable, began to show signs of strain. He slept fitfully. He paced the halls at night. He changed lovers weekly, searching not for affection, but for clarity. He spoke of omens of dreams where the Roman gods whispered threats in dead languages. He demanded more rituals, more sacrifices, more praise, and endless hunger that no ceremony could satisfy. Even Julia Soaemias, his mother and architect of his rise, began to worry. This was not the boy she had crowned. This was someone else, unrecognizable, untethered, dissolving into his own divinity. She attempted to rein him in, to reintroduce structure and restraint, but it was too late. Elagabalus had tasted absolute transformation, and he would not return to human limits. The people, too, began to shift. Where once they had cheered his parades, now they watched in silence. The awe was fading. In its place came confusion, then discomfort, then quiet resentment. The streets were still, but the city was holding its breath. In the 4th year of his reign, Elagabalus stood at the peak of his own creation. He had reshaped Rome in his image, genderless, borderless, divine. But power built on transgression is fragile. It burns hot and fast, and somewhere in the shadowed corridors of the palace, the whispers had begun again. Not prayers, but plots, because Rome could endure cruelty. It could even endure madness. But what it could not endure was transformation. By the 4th year of Elagabalus's reign, Rome was not merely confused. It was exhausted. What had once shocked now dulled the senses. The incense no longer stirred wonder, but nausea. The flutes and drums, once mistaken for celebration, now rang as omens. Citizens no longer asked what their emperor would do next. They asked what more can he possibly violate that hasn't already been defiled, and Elagabalus, unfazed, perhaps even emboldened by the silence of resistance, answered that question with unrelenting creativity. His court no longer resembled a seat of empire, but a stage where reality was remixed daily into divine absurdity. Advisors were chosen not for wisdom, but for beauty. Entire government decrees were delayed because the emperor insisted on consulting omens in rose petals or asking a eunuch lover for advice. Meetings were interrupted for dancing. Laws were proclaimed in verse. Decisions were made mid-orgy. He no longer flirted with religious blasphemy. He embraced it. Temples to Jupiter and Mars were stripped of offerings and rededicated to Elagabal. Statues of Roman gods were melted and reshaped into feminine forms, their gender and meaning rewritten. In the most stunning affront to Roman tradition, Elagabalus declared that all gods of Rome would now bow to the sun god of Syria and ordered their images brought to his temple not as equals, but as lesser deities offering tribute. Even his marriages took on a metaphysical tone. He claimed to be the wife of the moon. He wed male charioteers in public ceremonies, kissing them before the Senate and declaring his desire to be called empress, not emperor. He appeared before his guards in bridal veils, asking to be penetrated so he might conceive divine life. Ancient sources, horrified and unsure how to process what they were witnessing, couldn't decide whether to label him insane, possessed, or simply evil. But beneath their scorn lay a deeper fear. What if he was something new? What if the boundaries that defined Rome between man and woman, ruler and subject, sacred and profane, were not fixed? What if they were illusions? This was the existential threat Elagabalus posed. He didn't challenge Rome from the outside like a barbarian. He attacked from within by rewriting meaning itself. The Praetorian Guard, once indifferent, now seethed in silence. These were not only soldiers, they were traditionalists. Their loyalty was built on honor hierarchy and masculine command. But the man they were sworn to protect was no longer recognizable as a Roman emperor, or perhaps even as a man. Behind palace walls, rumors of rebellion simmered. Murmurs passed between guards on duty. He has declared himself Venus. He's ordered men and women to bathe together. He wants to castrate himself next. Julia Soaemias, his mother and closest advisor, saw it coming. She had raised her son to manipulate power, not dissolve it. Nesbit. She had expected eccentricity, perhaps even flamboyance, but not transcendence. And now, as Elagabalus slipped further into religious ecstasy and political delusion, she tried to contain the damage. She reinstated traditional advisors. She begged him to moderate his rituals. She encouraged him to speak to the Senate with dignity, to sit still during ceremonies, to stop discussing divine insemination in public. He laughed at her, or ignored her, or vanished into his temple for days, re-emerging in golden robes and declaring new edicts from dreams. He was no longer interested in ruling an empire. He was trying to become one, and the empire was bleeding. Tax revenues fell as administrators fled their posts, unable to function under a court ruled by dancers and dreamers. The Senate began drafting letters to the provinces, apologizing for imperial chaos. Even the most ambitious power brokers hesitated to approach the palace, afraid their presence alone might be taken as consent to madness. Religious leaders, both Roman and Eastern, debated whether Elagabalus had transcended blasphemy and entered some new category of divine contagion. But the final blow came in the winter of 221 CE, when Elagabalus made a declaration that even his mother could not defend. He would remove all Roman gods from their temples and replace them with icons of Elagabal. No longer content with syncretism, the emperor demanded religious submission. The Roman pantheon would be erased, the empire reborn under one god, and that god was him. It was a suicide note written in incense and blood. Within days, secret meetings began between Julia Mamaea, the emperor's aunt, and senior officers of the Praetorian Guard. Julia Mamaea was no fool. She had watched her nephew's descent from the sidelines with the patience of a chess master. Her son, Alexander Severus, was being groomed in silence. He was everything Elagabalus was not: stoic, masculine Roman, and crucially still untouched by scandal. She knew that the guards would not act without assurance. Assassination was a gamble, but now, finally, the absurd had become intolerable, and the price of doing nothing had become higher than the risk of betrayal. The plan was set for spring. The palace would be locked down under the pretense of increased security during a religious festival. Elagabalus and his mother would be summoned to a private meeting with the Praetorian commanders. There would be no trial, no proclamation, only silence, and then death. But before that day arrived, something shifted in Elagabalus. He began to hear things, whispers in the halls, shadows in his dreams. He spoke of betrayal of Roman gods punishing him for his disobedience. He demanded more sacrifices, more gold, more loyalty. He punished servants for imagined slights. He accused senators of heresy. His rituals became frenzied violent. Blood ran thicker in the temple. Music turned to screams. The transformation was complete. He was no longer a boy, not even a god. He had become a symbol too bright to survive, too alien to tolerate. And as the empire watched, paralyzed between awe and revulsion, it waited for someone, anyone, to finally draw the line. Rome. It turned out still had one tradition it would not abandon. When a god becomes too dangerous, you kill him. By the start of 222 CE, the sun no longer rose with promise over the Palatine Hill. It rose with dread. Inside the gilded palace walls, the boy who had once captivated legions with divine fire now paced marble floors in near silence, muttering to himself in languages few understood, sometimes Aramaic, sometimes Latin, often neither. His gaze, once radiant with theatrical confidence, had grown haunted. He no longer entered the Senate, draped in golden robes with dancers in tow. He arrived late, distracted, trembling, speaking of omens and enemies hiding in plain sight. He had become a shadow of his own spectacle, flickering, unstable, unpredictable. Elagabalus was unraveling, and Rome could feel it. At night, servants whispered that he no longer slept, that he wandered the palace halls barefoot, listening to the walls, that he spoke to the black meteorite as if it could answer, that he had burned letters from old lovers in ritual fire, then wept over the ashes. One chamberlain claimed the emperor had ordered the execution of 3 slaves, then canceled it the next day with apologies and gifts. Another swore he had seen Elagabalus dig through his own garden, claiming the Roman gods had buried curses there. Even his inner circle, once populated by adoring priests and lovers, had thinned. Those who remained did so out of fear or obligation, not loyalty. And those who could still see clearly, his mother, Julia Soaemias, chief among them, watched with growing horror as the boy she had raised to rule began dissolving under the weight of the very divinity he claimed. Julia Soaemias had gambled everything on her son. She had spread the lie that he was Caracalla's illegitimate child. She had forged the alliances, bribed the legions, and declared the divine right that brought him to power. She had taught him how to weaponize beauty theater and belief. But what she had not prepared for was this, that her son might actually believe in his own mythology, that he would lose himself inside it. She tried in vain to bring him back. She organized meetings with loyal Roman advisors. She arranged appearances meant to remind the public of his humanity. She pleaded with him to restore some traditional order, to return just enough dignity to his rule that the Praetorian Guard might calm. But Elagabalus would not listen. He accused her of betrayal. He wept in her arms one night, then banished her from his chambers the next. He claimed the gods had turned on him, not the Eastern gods, but the Roman ones. Jupiter, Mars, Minerva. He said their spirits were haunting him, furious at being displaced. And in his panic he grew more extreme. He ordered more sacrifices, stranger rituals, more public declarations of his cosmic marriage to divine entities. He proclaimed new festivals, demanded the execution of temple critics, and exiled senators he suspected of plotting even when they hadn't spoken to him in months. His guards watched with blank faces as he entered his temple and screamed prayers into the sky, his voice breaking with desperation. The black meteorite, once his symbol of strength, now seemed to watch him like an eye. Outside the palace, Julia Mamaea Elagabalus' aunt waited. Unlike Soaemias, she had not gambled. She had invested. Carefully. Quietly. She had built her position with the patience of a spider, spinning alliances through diplomacy and promise, rather than ecstasy and excess. Her son Alexander Severus had been raised not to shock Rome, but to soothe it. He was everything Elagabalus had abandoned, composed masculine Roman. She knew the city was ready, more than ready. The aristocrats who once avoided politics now begged for her guidance. The soldiers who once guarded the emperor now reported to her in secret. Even members of the Praetorian Guard had begun visiting her chambers under the cover of darkness, asking subtly what a new beginning might look like. It was no longer about religion, or gender, or spectacle. It was about survival. Rome, like all empires, tolerated eccentricity in its rulers, but not when it threatened the machinery of empire. Not when taxes went uncollected, laws unenforced, and soldiers unpaid. Not when governors in the provinces sent letters questioning whether Rome still stood for order. Elagabalus had stopped being a scandal. He had become a liability. The final straw came in early March 222 CE. Word spread that Elagabalus planned to remove all Roman gods from the city's temples entirely, to erase their presence altogether, and declare Elagabal the sole deity of the empire. Not even symbolic coexistence, erasure, replacement. That very day, Julia Mamaea sent her final message to the commanders of the guard. It was time. The plan was simple, brutal Roman. Elagabalus would be summoned to a private meeting with the guard to discuss festival security. His mother would accompany him. There would be no confrontation, no spectacle. He would not be assassinated in public or humiliated before the Senate. He would simply disappear. But Elagabalus knew. In his final days, his paranoia exploded into madness. He accused everyone, courtiers, slaves, guards, of betrayal. He dressed in full ceremonial robes and refused to eat food he had not blessed himself. He declared himself the reincarnation of Venus and prophesied that Rome shall weep when the sun god is extinguished. He ordered 20 sacrifices in a single day. He tried to flee the palace only to be dragged back by guards who no longer looked him in the eyes. And yet there was something heartbreaking in his descent. Because beneath the divine delusions and ritual hysteria, there remained the shadow of a boy, a child crowned too soon, a priest who had mistaken theater for destiny, a dreamer who had dared to believe that Rome, unchanging, unyielding Rome, could be remade in his image. In the palace gardens, he was seen one last time, standing barefoot under the stars, alone, staring up at the sky, whispering to something no one else could see, a god, a memory, a future that would never come. No one knows, but those who were there say his face was not angry. It was tired, as if even the sun god himself had burned out. And in the silence that followed as the plan closed around him and his fate was sealed, Rome exhaled for the first time in 4 years and prepared to bury not just an emperor, but an idea. The idea that identity could be fluid, that gods could be rewritten, that power could wear silk and speak in song. The sun was setting, and in the shadows, the knives were already drawn. It ended not with a battle nor with riots in the streets, but with a knock on the wrong door at the wrong time. March 11th, 222 CE. The imperial palace in Rome stirred with deceptive calm. A festival had been announced for the coming week, one meant to honor the divine union of Elagabal and the goddess Victory. Flowers had been ordered, musicians rehearsed, priests prepared to recite verses no Roman had ever heard before. On the surface, all was as it had been for 4 chaotic, dazzling, and delirious years. But inside the marble walls of the palace, the air had changed. That morning, Elagabalus and his mother, Julia Soaemias, received a summons from the Praetorian Guard, Rome's elite protectors of the emperor. The message was simple, formal, a private meeting with the commanders to discuss security arrangements for the upcoming celebration. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming, except that for days now, Elagabalus had been convinced something was coming. He had stopped trusting his guards. He had been sleeping in different rooms each night, speaking of shadows, betrayal, and divine judgment. Still the boy god went. Maybe he thought his presence alone could disarm their doubts. Maybe he believed his robes, his titles, his aura were still enough to hold men in awe. Or maybe deep down he was tired of running from the inevitable. He entered the appointed chamber with his mother by his side, both draped in ceremonial finery, she in violet silk, he in white and gold eyes, lined with coal wrists jangling with jewelry, his movements measured like a priest walking into the Holy of Holies. But there were no priests waiting inside. Only steel, only silence. The guards didn't shout. They didn't announce a sentence or list accusations. They simply drew their blades and closed the door. Julia Soemius moved first, stepping between the men and her son. She had brought him into this world with cunning and fury, and she would not let him leave it alone. She reached for him, perhaps to shield him, perhaps to pray. She was cut down before she could finish the gesture. Elagabalus followed seconds later. No defense, no miracle, no divine intervention. The boy who had called himself the sun god, who had danced through Rome in silk and gold, who had dared to marry a meteorite and reorder the heavens, died on a cold palace floor, not as a deity, but as a teenager murdered by the very men once sworn to protect him. But death was not enough. Rome needed purification. The corpses were dragged through the streets of the city they had ruled, stripped, mutilated, humiliated. They were pulled through the sewers, Rome's symbolic intestines, then tossed into the Tiber River like refuse. The city watched. Some cheered, some watched in silence, and some wept not out of love for Elagabalus, but out of fear for what his death meant. Because in killing this boy, Rome was not just removing a ruler, it was rejecting everything he had stood for: the ambiguity, the femininity, the sacred violation of borders between gods and men and women, east and west, Rome and not Rome. Within hours, Alexander Severus, son of Julia Mamaea and cousin of the fallen emperor, was proclaimed Caesar. He was 13, but unlike Elagabalus, he came wrapped not in perfume and prophecy, but in promises of order, of masculinity, of Roman tradition restored. His youth was not seen as a risk, but a relief. His reign still to come would be curated carefully by his mother, and the Senate sanitized of all the divine chaos that had preceded it. Elagabalus's temples were shut, his priests arrested or executed. The meteorite was quietly shipped back to Syria like a relic of madness best forgotten. His edicts were repealed, his lovers disappeared, his portraits were torn down, even his name was stripped from official records. But names like gods do not always vanish. In whispered corners of the empire, stories continued to circulate. Of the boy who wore pearls and wielded power. Of the emperor who made Rome question itself. Of the festival where the gods refused to appear. Of the moment the sun set in Rome, not in the sky, but in the soul of the empire. Because Rome had won. The old order had reasserted itself. Masculine, disciplined, severe. But something had been exposed, and it would never fully be covered again. They had killed the boy. But the idea survived. What are we to make of Elagabalus? Was he a monster or a mirror? A divine blasphemy or a warning about the fragility of the systems we build? The Roman elite called him mad, degenerate, unnatural. They said his reign was a stain on the imperial legacy, a cautionary tale of what happens when indulgence replaces discipline. And yet beneath their condemnation lies something deeper: fear. Fear that a teenager armed not with armies but with vision could expose how arbitrary their values truly were. Because Elagabalus didn't just challenge Rome's traditions, he unmasked them. He made visible what Rome tried to keep invisible: fluid identity, erotic power, foreign spirituality, and the deep performative nature of political legitimacy. He blurred the lines Rome needed to believe were sacred, and in doing so revealed that those lines were choices, not truths. His reign was short, erratic, and in many ways disastrous, but it forced an empire to ask, what is power if it wears perfume? What is divinity if it bleeds? What is Rome if its gods can be replaced by a meteorite and a boy in silk? History buried Elagabalus beneath layers of shame, mockery, and silence. But the questions he raised, the questions he embodied, survive. They linger wherever power disguises itself as permanence, wherever identity is policed in the name of order, wherever tradition demands obedience without reflection. And maybe that's the most unsettling truth of all. Not that Elagabalus failed, but that he was possible.